All right, we are here today to talk about Section 401 water quality certifications. Um, I'm Jen Oknick. I've been in water resources regulatory for most of my career. For the past 8.5 years, I've served as MPCA's Metallic Mineral Mine 401 Project Manager, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I think Bill's going to come off of mute. Or not. I'm here with Bill Wildy. He's been with the PCA for 16 years and has been a 401 project manager for most of that time. I want to thank you for having us here today and for your interest in our program. Am I still presenting?
Sorry, Jen, that's my fault. I was trying to get Bill on.
Sorry about that.
Now I'm here. I'm frantically chatting, but no one was responding. So thanks a lot. Okay, we're good.
All right. So my screens are a little messed up right now. Let me get back. Share again. Presentation mode. There we go. All right, here's our outline for the day. We're going to cover 401 water quality certifications, the authority MPCA has to issue them, what types of projects get certifications, and the process we go through to review projects and make a final decision. MPCA has 4 staff who work on these certifications, and we do a lot of consulting with staff in other areas of MPCA and with other agencies at the state and federal level. Certifications ensure Minnesota water quality standards are met. So that's our little niche in the water resources regulatory world. We take care of water quality standards. So the background, the 401 program gets its name from Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, where the goals and requirements for certification are established. Basically, it lays out a path states and tribes can take as certifying agencies to ensure actions authorized by the federal government, typically through a permit or license, will not negatively impact our waters. So a federal government agency cannot authorize something that will degrade waters of the state. The MPCA is the certifying agency for the state of Minnesota. 4 tribes also that we share boundaries of Minnesota are also certifying authorities. These are the Fond du Lac Band, the Grand Portage Band, the Leech Lake Band, and the Red Lake Band. This treatment as a state is how tribes can opt into various programs administered by the EPA. Generally speaking, water quality standards are set to maintain the physical, chemical, and biological health of our waters. The original intent was for 401 to open a project to state review for all waters of the state and all water quality standards. However, as we'll get to in the next slide, that's been in flux since the fall of 2020. The 401 program is often thought of as the wetland program at MPCA because many of the projects that come to us requesting certification involve wetlands. We will get into the types of projects this applies to in a bit. Here are the changing federal regulations. These are just the recent ones. As I was saying, for the past 50 years, the 401 language remained unchanged. When MPCA received a certification request, it reviewed the entire project for compliance with water quality standards on all waters of the state, which is a broad definition, but it's been changing lately. I would love to get to that question at the end. So the waters of the United States definition changed and the 401 rule changed in 2020. In 2021, the 401 rule was vacated, but in 2022 it came back. So thank you for hanging in there with us as we go through this. In 2022, EPA published a new set of 401 rules. They put it out for comment. EPA is currently still looking through those comments to determine what to do with the 401 rule. And the waters of the United States definition has changed again. So what needs a 401 certification? First and foremost, in order to trigger the need for a 401 certification, there must be federal action, and that's either a permit or a license. Most of the ones that we deal with are permits from the Army Corps of Engineers, but we also get some that are licenses issued by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. There needs to be a potential discharge of dredge or fill material into a water of the United States from a point source. And a discharge doesn't necessarily mean pollution in the standard sense. It could also be something like a change in flow because of a dam. The most common requests we get for certification are associated with Section 404 permits, which are issued by the Army Corps of Engineers. These are often referred to as dredge and fill, as I've mentioned. The project size and potential impacts can influence what kind of permit they will issue. There are two types of broad categories of permits issued by the Corps and in Minnesota, and one project-specific permit. All of these Section 404 permits need certification by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So the broad categories are nationwide permits and regional general permits. These are used for projects that meet specific criteria, things like beach creation, beach raking, piers and docks, restorations, that kind of thing. Letters of permission have mostly been phased out in Minnesota, but they are another type of permit that falls under the general permit category. And looking under those nationwide regional general permits, and all general permits have been batch approved by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's 401 staff, with exceptions, which are conditions. These are conditions that must be met in order for a project to move forward with one of the broad categories of permits. And the other lumping are individual permits. Individual permits are issued when a project doesn't meet the criteria of one of those broad categories, one of the nationwide or regional general. You need to carefully read your nationwide or your regional general permit if you receive one, because you may receive one that requires a Section 401 certification. They might not meet that batch approval. There might be a condition that says you need to get a 401 in these situations. For example, you might have a stream restoration project that meets a nationwide permit, so it's good by the Corps, but it might be longer than 300 linear feet, which means that you would need a Section 401 certification from the PCA. And then on FERC projects, they issue permits that fall under PCA's authority to condition. Most of these we see are hydroelectric dam licenses. FERCs are projects that are long-term. The permitting and licensing can take about 5 years, but they are good for 40 to 50 years. On FERC projects, the rules specifically require advanced notice of the projects to the regulatory authority and the ability for agencies to request studies, like fish studies, to be conducted as part of the project before construction takes place. So when do you need to contact 401 staff? The applicant needs to get involved with 401 staff when an individual standard permit is involved, because individual standard permits require an individual Section 401 in order to work. You need to contact us if the project doesn't meet conditions of the NWP, the nationwide permit, or the regional general permit. Remember that stream example? So when you read them and it doesn't meet all the conditions, you need to give us a call. Sometimes the federal agency might let you know that you need to contact us, but it's not their job. So if you're unsure, we'd love to hear from you. Our contact information is at the end of this presentation. How do you request a 401? So how to get started with this process? The process for requesting a certification from the PCA has changed slightly under the rules, as we alluded to earlier. A pre-filing meeting is needed. A pre-filing meeting must be requested by the applicant of the PCA before the applicant can request a certification. So generally speaking, you have to talk to us 30 days before you can submit a request for certification. And a request for certification and application I'm going to use interchangeably. So Hopefully this is making sense. PCA is not obligated to hold this meeting, but we strongly believe that pre-application meetings help everyone involved to discuss the project, like the impacts and the mitigation, the process, and any potential problems like data gaps, alternatives, analysis, missing forms, that kind of thing, before you get to the point of submitting a certification request. A certification request must include 40 CFR 121.5, which is the 2020-401 rule citation, but the joint application form that I'm sure so many of you are so very familiar with satisfies this almost every time. You also, to be submitting a complete certification request, need to send in an anti-degradation assessment. You can either follow this form that we have on our website, or you can go through the rules on your own and make sure that the anti-degradation meets everything listed out in the rule. An anti-degradation assessment is required of all projects before they can be certified by the Pollution Control Agency. It's one of our water quality standards. The anti-degradation looks at the quality of the waters since 1975 to ensure that no degradation by the project occurs. It looks at impaired waters that might receive discharge from the project and more. So the MPCA review process, once it's officially in-house, 401 staff review application materials like the joint application, the anti-degradation, and reach out to coordinate with the applicant and other regulatory resource groups to ensure a smooth process. The applicants must take certain steps to ensure the impact to water resources is as small as possible and water quality standards are met. Therefore, when you're reviewing a project, we look to see if these steps have been completed. Minimizing impacts is a requirement of a number of federal and state regulations, including Section 401, and is a key part of anti-degradation. Our goal, like so many programs, is always to avoid impacts, but if impacts are inevitable, we look at the project design, including all alternatives, as required by so many federal and state regulations, to determine how those impacts can be minimized, and ultimately whatever impacts do occur need to be mitigated. Once we've completed the review, we move into the decision-making phase. MPCA has 3 options available in the 401 program. We can deny, waive, or certify, and certify can be a straight certification or certification with conditions. A project may get denied if the applicant has not demonstrated the activities will comply with state water quality standards. Denial isn't necessarily the end of the road for a project. The proposer can modify the design and reapply for a certification in the future. Waive means that we give up our authority to make a decision on the project. Waivers occur in different circumstances. If we simply fail to take action on a project, a procedural waiver happens, and the federal permitting process continues. We can actively waive a project. This might happen because all of the elements that we look at for 401 are already covered by the federal permit, or because the applicant will be required to get another permit that will address our concerns, such as a construction stormwater permit. This is another area where 401 staff are working closely with other PCA programs and agencies to make sure everything is covered and we do it as efficiently as possible. Certification is an approval. A certification with conditions means that we believe a project will meet water quality standards if it follows its application materials and all conditions given in the Section 401 certification. Common conditions include mitigation, monitoring, and the implementation of best management practices. Excuse me. A draft decision goes to tribes 2 weeks before the public notice begins. The project goes on public notice for input. The minimum is 10 days. We may receive requests for public hearing or contest a case, which if you're worried about the timeline, we have no control over whether or not it gets extended for those things. We review all the comments and we issue a final decision. Note on mitigation, we require what's called type for type mitigation in the 401 program. That means that if an impact happens to a wetland, the state needs wetland mitigation. If the state loses stream function or value, the state needs stream mitigation. A project proposer can mitigate on-site, purchase credits from a bank, or possibly work with state or local agencies to fund a stream mitigation. But this needs to be approved by the PCA. There's no guarantee of this one working. As long as we're on stream mitigation, I have a note for SQT fans. Using the SQT on a stream segment that is about to be degraded as a way of setting a mitigation goal somewhere else might result in a plan being in conflict with Minnesota rules. Minnesota rules require mitigation of the highest attained state of a stream between today and backwards to 1975. That's called existing use, which is not necessarily what's on the ground today and could result in under mitigation. For example, if you're looking at a 1,000-foot stream segment that's been degraded after 1975, it was looking great in 1975, not so much today, and you're running the SQT on it today, the SQT might say the stream is functioning at 500 feet. You cannot then mitigate for 500 feet of functional stream because this would violate state water quality standards, specifically anti-degradation. You would need to mitigate for the 1,000 feet because the existing use of that stream is a good-looking stream close to 1975. And feel free to ask questions on that later or email. It's maybe not something that you're going to run into. Got a couple examples. Enbridge Line 3, a lot of people have heard of this. It is the largest and most complex 401 certification from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. We set up a payment in lieu condition to cover compensation of the streams. So they put aside funding to pay for stream mitigation with MPCA's approval. There was a contested case hearing on this project, and to this day, there is ongoing monitoring of impacts associated with pipeline construction. Our last example is the Minnesota Beach Nourishment Project. This project is unique because it's managed by the Army Corps of Engineers. The primary purpose of the dredging activity is to maintain the shipping channel in the Duluth Superior Harbor. With dredging comes the question of where the materials will go. If material is contaminated, it must be disposed of properly in a confined facility. But if the materials meet certain thresholds and is deemed safe, it can be used in other projects like adding sand to existing beaches. The 401 certification included conditions related to both the dredging activity and the placement of the material. Best management practices that prevent turbidity from leaving the project area are required during dredging, and the material must be placed on the beach, causing as little disruption as possible. So that's our presentation. We'll open it up to discussions and questions. I'm going to move on to the thank you slide, and Bill's going to unmute. Again, I'm Jen Oakneck. I work exclusively on metallic mineral mines as a 401 project manager in state policy, and Bill is with me today presenting. Odds are good if you are looking for a 401 project manager or have a question, you'll either get Bill or you'll get Kirsten. And I'll stop sharing right now. Well, maybe I should leave it up in case somebody's taking notes.
Yeah, I think that's great. We can maybe leave it up for a split second while we do questions, which may come at the very end again, but
perfectly fine.
But maybe if we have a couple now, we can just address them while we're in the flow of it, if that works for you.
Whatever works.
Okay. So I had a question. How do we figure out what the condition of a stream was in 1975?
That's a magical question. It's a lot of best professional judgment. Sometimes we get lucky, and there's like aerial photography from that time period. We can generally tell from aerial photography, like if it's farm field back in 1975, it's probably of a certain condition. sometimes we get lucky and there's an EIS or an EAW, some kind of environmental review from that period. One of my projects had an environmental review from the 70s that we were able to look at and see the quality of the stream. And to, yeah, just reach out, contact us. We'll do our best to work with you. We've got a lot of in-house experts too that can really help you walk through there. Bill's saying he can't get unmuted.
Yeah, maybe Ted can, he seemed to have fixed it last time, so I'll ask Ted to do it again. Looks like another question came in here. What level of inspection and enforcement does the PCA do for 401 projects?
We work with our CNE. What are they? Oh, Mark, what is it? I'm blanking. I'm sorry. I'm a little nervous. Compliance and enforcement officers. We work with our compliance and enforcement officers to work through any kind of 401 issues. 401 issues, 401s become a condition of the federal permit. So we work closely too with the federal agencies because the federal agencies are supposed to be enforcing these, but we work together on that.
Okay.
Hey, Jen, thanks a lot for doing all this. I was quiet for the time, but I really appreciate you going through this on your own and making that presentation. It was a good one. I think you covered the question so far, and I can't think of anything else to add at this time.
Okay, that sounds great. I just want to remind everybody, if you have any questions, just keep chatting them in the corner, and we can address all of them at the end as well. So if something else comes up, by all means, ask it. But we can hand it over to Mark if that works for everybody.
Everybody, or at least somebody, hear me?
I can hear you. Well, now I can't hear you anymore, Mark.
How about now?
Yep, now I can hear you. Can you hear us?
Okay.
Perfect.
Yep.
Great.
All right. So I am mouse up to go find my presentation. So if we can make that happen and share. Let's go share. All right, let's see here.
I can see it.
Okay. Now, how do I get the okay off that screen?
We can't see it, but I know what you're talking about. Do you have another
all right,
screen?
fantastic. Nope.
Yeah.
I've
Okay.
got two screens. I opted to just move to one of our little conference rooms rather than sit at my desk. So things are a little bit different for me, but thank you for your patience. Thanks everybody for the invitation, for having to sit through a presentation for me and another presentation. Some of you, I think, were at the soiree in December. Same guy, Mark Gernes, a research scientist here at the Pollution Control Agency. In December, I was talking about some of the field stories, excursions over the years. And here I'm going to be talking about some work that actually I did a couple of years back. I was asked to look at some of our wetland data over about the last 25 years in support of a PCA water quality standard rule revision. And so that's what really got me into this analysis and looking at plants and salts. And so why did that not go to the next slide? There we go. Okay. I'm sure many of you have heard the terms freshwater or saline or brackish. Minnesota, for the most part, is all fresh water. There are a couple of exceptions. In the very western part of the state, some of you may have been to the little town of Marietta. There actually is a shallow lake out there called Salt Lake. It is brackish, bordering on saline. That's its natural condition. It's actually a great birding spot if you ever want to go check it out, if you happen to be a birder. But other than Salt Lake and a couple of wetlands in that area, the vast majority, essentially everything else that I'm aware of, at least in Minnesota, would naturally be considered fresh water. So, what is that threshold for fresh water? This is a little sketch or diagram, I guess, illustration from Wikipedia that I threw in, that basically at 500 milligram per liter, 500 parts per million of chloride, of salt, brings you above fresh water. So anything below 500 is going to be considered fresh water. And for the most part, as we'll see, most of Minnesota waters are going to be well below that, at least wetland waters. And I'm only talking about wetlands here. So that aside, most of our waters are in fact fresh water, but we do have some anthropogenic influences that seem to be of potential concern. And certainly this last month or so, it's been kind of a challenging winter. And we all know that there are de-icing compounds. Majority of them are salts that are used to try to keep our roadways and walkways and so forth safer for us. There's also a couple of other sources of salts that are being introduced in the environment that are fairly significant. The one is the use of water softeners, both residential as well as municipal. And those water softeners, as I think you probably are all aware, use rock salt to strip away the resin, and then salt is essentially discharged through the softening process to the wastewater treatment plant. The wastewater treatment plant does not remove those salts. It gets discharged into whatever the receiving water is going to be, if that's a river or a lake or a wetland, and how those waters then might connect to other wetlands potentially. So fertilizer is also a pretty significant, in some parts of the state, a pretty significant source of salts that are being introduced to the environment. Particularly potassium chloride is one of the common salts that's in fertilizer. It's for uses agriculture that needs potassium. That's the primary source, potassium chloride. There are other salts that are in fertilizer as well, but that is one that I guess I'll just bring to the conversation here. And it seems to actually be increasing in use over the last 15, 20 years. I don't actually know the reason for that, but that is something that seems to be happening. So these are kind of some background, I guess, concepts that I just wanted to kind of start the conversation with as we kind of make our way into talking about the effects of salts on plants, specifically wetland plants. And so the effects of salts on plants can be many. Increasing the amount of salinity, if I can use that term, often disrupts the plant's ability to maintain trigger pressure, which is essentially the osmotic balance. And we don't probably think about plants having, a lively physiology, but indeed they do. And we all know they photosynthesize and they also respire. Excess salts can very much disrupt those biological processes, photosynthesis and respiration, as well as many enzymatic processes, especially in some of the marine and estuarine situations. Many plants have adapted and developed methods to deal with higher salt concentrations. And one of the more common ones that many plants use is essentially to pull the salts out of their cytoplasm and store it, salt crystals, in vacuoles where it's sequestered out of the plasma. And some plants have even taken it to another step. Rather than storing it in vacuoles, they even have developed active salt excretion type adaptations. These are not very typical, and I don't really of wetlands, of plants that occur in freshwater settings, but certainly in more saline type environments, marine environments, we definitely do see this in plants. Some plants have developed active mechanisms, so they use energetics, apply energy to assure that they can maintain nutrient uptake challenges, because a lot of the chemistry for plants' metabolism is based on simple diffusion. Others are active uptake. In any case, add more salts in increased environmental load, and it can disrupt things like nutrient management. Lastly, just to kind of move on here, many plants that seem to be adapted, or at least more tolerant to salty conditions or high salinity, are often also, those same plants seem to be more tolerant to other types of stressors, such as increased nutrient loading or hydrologic stress. And I didn't put this point up here, but I did want to mention that a lot of the plants that are, let's just use cattails, for instance. You'll find that cattails that grow along the Atlantic seaboard may be adapted to higher levels of salts than what our cattails here are. And cattails might not be the best example because, as we'll see, they probably are among the more tolerant species. But the point being that there is some ecotype variation among individual species, where in parts of the state or parts of the country where they are exposed to higher levels of salts, they seem to have a different adaptation than that same species in the Midwest. So the three, I just term this kind of salt salinity or salty variables. The three variables that I looked at in this work, and I'll be presenting here with a few graphs and some data analyses, are specific conductance, specific chloride, and sulfate. Specific conductance, I think many of you are probably well aware that it's the ability of electricity to move through water. It's essentially just measuring that. And the more salts you have in the water, the higher the specific conductance, the more electricity can be conducted. Chloride is more straightforward as a concentration, as is sulfate. They're both anions, negatively charged. They both are micronutrients to plants, so all plants need a little bit of chloride, a little bit of sulfate. But when you get too much, that can cause a problem, as we mentioned earlier, things like the osmotic balance and so forth. Again, it's not advancing for me. Another trick here.
I've never seen that before. Sorry, I'm not totally sure.
Yeah, this is disappointing because if I hit enter, usually that's a way to advance. Let's try this method.
Are you sure you're on the active screen? Like click on your slide to make sure it's not entering another program or something.
Yeah, maybe. I apologize. What is going on here? There we go.
Oh,
Okay.
there we go. Great.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Hope everybody got a good stretch in or told the joke between there. All right. So I'm not going to go too far into this. Again, this is some background. State water quality standards. This is what kind of got me into doing some of this analysis that we're going to be talking about. There was a rulemaking that was done a few years back that was looking at some of the salinity variables, primarily for the class 3 and class 4 use classes. As Jen touched on, a lot of the regulatory oversights, and a lot of the pollution protection activity that TMDLs, things of that nature that PCA is involved with, circles around this concept of beneficial uses. And so our waters have been attributed different uses or use classes depending upon how those waters are being used. Or so like class 1, if there are surface waters in the state that are being used for domestic consumption, and we need to have certain levels of protection to protect the suitability of that water to be used for domestic consumption. So that's maintained at a class 1. So standards are applied at that level for those waters. The vast majority of our waters in the state are what we call class 2, and then they're also class 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So all of these really apply kind of in a mosaic. But class 2 is, if you were to go in and look at what the numeric standards are, that's where you're going to find the vast majority of numeric standards in state water quality standards will be applied at a class 2. And that's to protect aquatic life and recreational type uses. Now, many of you have probably heard the term fishable and swimmable, and that's actually kind of an older term. It's a term that was really applied in the interim goals of the Clean Water Act back in the early 70s and even in maybe into the 80s. But in these days, we really have kind of moved beyond that interim goal, and we're really more focused on protecting the broader array of aquatic life. And of course, that includes invertebrates and fish and amphibians, plants. So I think you get that picture, hopefully. So it's about the ability for the waters to provide those uses. And if they don't provide the uses, then they might be considered to be quote unquote impaired. And so class 3 use of industrial users of water for maybe canning or ethanol production or other things like that need very high quality water for many of their processes. And so there's a use class and specific standards that are applied to protect that. I'm not going to go through all of these in great detail, but I do want to touch on class 4 because that's where the sulfate standard, the state sulfate standard, is at. And that sulfate standard will, as we'll talk about, is applied really to protect for a plant, wild rice. So it's somewhat unique. The last just quick comment I'll make is class 7 waters are specifically petitioned to be redesignated from being maintained for class 2 uses. They are evaluated to show that they really are not, practically speaking, able to ever reach class 2. There's been some major change. So maybe a permittee rather, would petition the PCA that, hey, this is really not ever going to be class 2 water, so can we get a little bit of lightening of some of the standards? And that's where it goes into a class 7. So class 7 decouples a water from the class 2 use. All right, so just a little bit more on the state standards, zero in on those 3 variables that I touched on earlier. Chloride, I think we're all aware, or if you're not, the state chloride standard is 230 milligrams per liter. And that is what is being enforced in permits. That is what is being used for TMDLs. There are a number of waters, lakes, streams, even a few wetlands that have been listed. that have not been able to meet that 230 number. It's actually a very old standard. It's based on guidance that EPA, US EPA released back in the late 70s, early 80s. It's roughly for kind of the average person, roughly about the point where you can start to taste saltiness. So just to give you a little bit of a touch points of that, 230. I mentioned it's an old standard. I've actually gone back and looked at that guidance from late 80s, late 70s, early 80s. I think it was an 82 publication. And they review several studies, and many of those studies that they reviewed were primarily focused on invertebrates and fish. There were a few studies that they referenced that looked at plants and a few that looked at algae. But they more or less come right out and say that at the time, they felt that the need to protect algae, and for that matter, plants, was not as central. So they kind of discounted some of the studies that showed some fairly low concentrations of chloride for, in particular, a couple of algae. So I found that very interesting. But in any case, sulfate I alluded to, it's a class 4 standard, and that standard is 10 milligrams per liter. And it's only applicable in cases where wild rice is growing. So waters that support wild rice are able to be protected at a class 10, a 10 milligram per liter of sulfate. There was actually an early limnologist who worked for the Minnesota Department of Conservation. That takes it back a few years, a man by the name of Dr. John Moyle, who did his PhD at the University of Minnesota. And John Moyle, his PhD looked at the effect of ions on aquatic plants, particularly wild rice. And there are a number of memos in the record that he really encouraged when PCA was first beginning to adopt water quality standards in the late 70s, early 80s. Dr. Moyle had really encouraged PCA to adopt a sulfate standard. I believe we are still the only state. There may be a couple of tribes, but I believe the only state in the country that has a standard for sulfate. If we're not the only, there's only maybe one or two others at most. And then lastly, specific conductance. We talked about that being the ability of water to conduct electricity. There had been a state standard of 1,000 microsiemens per centimeter is the unit. That actually got removed from state standards in that rulemaking that I referenced, the class 3-4 rule revision. It was removed with the intent that it may be more appropriate to have a specific conductance standard applied for class 2 waters. So we don't currently have a standard for specific conductance, but it's likely that it will reappear with a different number at some point in the future. And it had been set at 1,000 microsiemens. Many of the industries that they looked at that and they said that's way too high for protecting our uses. We're having to use reverse osmosis or other technology. Usually it's reverse osmosis, and so it's like it's not really helping us at all. So we felt if it's not being useful, let's take it off the books. So I think that's the trip through standards. Again. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm on that screen. Why it's not advancing slides? Apologize for this. If anyone needs to technology is great when it works, right? And when it doesn't work, page up. We will try some. Okay, I've got to figure this out. I apologize. And you lose your cursor. I think I may, if you don't mind, I'm going to exit out and I'm going to just go into slide visuals. Thinking if it'll allow me to do that. That doesn't work either. I don't know. Can you guys hear when I click? I'm getting
No.
a beep on my end every time I hit the
Oh.
way I typically advance is I hit the enter key. And every time I hit the enter key, it's like it's sending a resounding.
When I tried it here, it looks like it might be the mute shortcut, which is probably what that beep is. Whenever you hear the beep, it might be muting you for a second.
Yeah, okay.
Do you want to try the arrow key? Do you have an arrow key on yours? That's what I usually do when I do presentations.
I do have an arrow key.
Try that.
Yeah, usually you can go arrow forward and arrow back, and it's just not working.
Do you want to, try hitting exit, or did you say that didn't work?
Okay. You want to change. Don't save. Okay. It's gone. Let's reopen. Open. Okay, I can see it on my end.
Yep, we can see it too.
You can see it. Okay, fantastic. There, okay.
Oh, there you go.
There, all right. Let's just go back. All right. So you can see my screen. Are you
Yep, looks
seeing it?
good.
Okay.
We're seeing like not present mode, but I think that's okay. It's
Yeah,
really working.
yeah.
So
The challenge might be, let's see if I do this. If I expand it just a little bit.
yeah,
'cause
that looks great.
Okay. Yeah. So, all right. That's the background. Apologize for the advancing issues. Now we're going to kind of get into the meat of the presentation, 25 minutes in. So many of you know, I have been with the agency for many years. I guess it's probably over 30 now. And I've had the good fortune of much of that time, close to 30 years now, being able to do a lot of field work. And most of that field work has been focused on wetlands and wetland monitoring. Much of that has been focused on plants. I'm a plant ecologist by training. And so this is a map of 464 places around the state that we have collected wetland data. So these are, for the most part, what I use the term depressional wetlands. Some of you are maybe more familiar with marshes. So these are typically marshes. They have a water column and some emergent plants. There are certainly have been exceptions. Some of these wetland sites were other than marshes, but typically they are a marsh type community. shallow marshes in particular, sometimes shallow open water. But so 64 different places around the state, and that we've collected connectivity. This, maps showing connectivity, and you can see two things. First, there are the 3 ecoregions, and many of you are maybe more familiar with DNR's ecological classification system, and we use the ecoregion concept, which is really something from US EPA. They tend to apply that stratification approach for geographic variation. And so we have 3 ecoregions present in Minnesota. This is at the level 2 level. You can drill down and dissect things further, but at level 2 ecoregion scale, you get the temperate prairies in the western and southern part of the state. You get the mixed wood plains, which is essentially the hardwood forests of the central region of the state. And then the northeast is what we call the mixed wood shield. So there are 3 ecoregions in the state. And the other thing that we see in this map is it's color coded to the legend here, but in general, there is a gradient of conductivity, also a gradient of chloride and sulfate, south to north, and particularly from east to west. And so you'll see that in the western part of the state, that's where we get some very high conductivities. Over 1,000 would have exceeded the previous standard. This is where somewhere like right in here is where Marietta, that Salt Lake is. I think it's in Big Stone County. And then we see some of at the other end of the spectrum, some of these green stars, those are very low conductivity, less than 25 microsiemens per centimeter. These are, soft water type systems. They are probably largely rain fed, don't have a lot of land runoff, can pick up more salts when you get more exposure to the soils. So there are these gradients, these natural gradients across the state that I wanted you to be aware of when you talk about salinity. The other thing that is important to really recognize is this is the work that I, again, will be presenting here in a couple of slides in terms of sensitivity and tolerance of, which plants are tolerant, which plants are sensitive to salts, or more so. This is based on field studies. This is not lab assays. This is not something that would generate like an LC50 after 72 hours or some other benchtop assay that we're used to seeing with some of the invertebrate or fish, or you can do it with plants. You can certainly do it with germination, survival, or young seedling survival over a period of time. That's not what this is. This is taking large data sets that are field data sets, and it includes 2 components. It includes the plant part, and it includes water chemistry. Ideally, those should be synchronous. They should be collected at the same time. Vast majority of the data that I looked at were collected at the same date, same time. There were some that we collected our plant data slightly separated from when we do our invertebrate sampling, and the invertebrate sampling happened to be when we collected the chemistry. So there are a few data points that are a little disjunct, but they're within that same year, within the same site, within that same sort of kind of period, I'll call it. And so it's over the period of roughly 1995 to 2017. That's the data record, and mostly depressional. The number of sites is as I showed on the map, roughly 460 some sites. So over 64 some sites, what do we see in terms of some descriptive statistics in terms of conductivity, chloride, and sulfate? Statewide, this is broken out statewide as well as by the 3 ecoregions, those 3 level 2 ecoregions. Statewide, at the mean, we're seeing conductivity is coming in right around 486 microsiemens per centimeter. If we look across the, sorry about that. is most bad sensitive. If we look across to the 3 ecoregions, there is a nice breakdown. Temperate prairies, highest conductivity. We kind of find the middle ground in the mixed wood plains, and very low conductivity typically on average in the mixed wood shield. If chloride is somewhat more interesting, as is sulfate. If we look statewide, the mean is right around 22. Remember, a state standard is 230. So this is the mean of all of our chloride sites statewide, or chloride samples, I should say. You can see there's some variability between the 3 ecoregions, and here the mixed wood plains is the highest of the 3, which is a little surprising, but that's probably the result of urban influence, because mixed wood plains, the Twin Cities, as well as some of the larger communities, St. Cloud and on up that corridor, I-94 corridor, they are all in the mixed wood plains ecoregion. And there's certainly some urban influence. That northeast part of the state, very low on average chloride. Sulfate, kind of the same pattern as we see with conductivity as a mean, with the kind of the exception, I guess, well, it's the same pattern. The temperate prairies, we see a fairly high amount of sulfate, well above the 10 milligram per liter. We don't have much wild rice out in that part of the state in the the temperate prairies. We do see where wild rice principally occurs in the northeast, the mixed wood shield, and in the mixed wood plains, that we are right around that 10 milligram per liter as an average for sulfate. So just kind of looking at the chemistry data on its own. If we then, okay, thank you for bearing with me. Now we are getting into something a little bit different. The method that I used, we will see, came from some science and publications from US EPA, and they use what they called an extirpation value approach. And so part of that, we look at some probability plots. And so these are just 3 example probability plots for 3 separate species against conductivity. And there are 3 general patterns that we see in these general effects probability plots, or GAM plots, as you might, they're often called, general effects model. So Calamagrostis canadensis, and I apologize, some of you guys I think probably, use the common names, and I tend to use the scientific, but Calamagrostis is Canada blue joint. I think we probably all know that. And the pattern that we see in the GAM plot is, as you start low in conductivity, there's a high probability that we could see Canada blue joint. It's really pretty happy at that low conductivity region. As the conductivity increases, it decreases. So it's kind of an inverse relationship, that the plant decreases as the chemistry influence increases. And the red line, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next couple of slides, but the red line is the extirpation, potential extirpation. And for this point, it's more or less at the inflection of the curve. In this unimodal type pattern, which is the second, it's not as common. We see a lot of the GAM plots are in fact either the decreasing and then a fair number are also increasing. And there are a few unimodals. So it's basically a little bit of conductivity. Seems like it does actually improve the marsh milkweed. Marsh milkweed's probably a little happier when it has a little bit more conductivity, a little more salts going on around it. But when you increase those salts, when conductivity gets higher, it's not very not very happy, and it tends to decrease in its the probability of it. So these are all probability plots across a distribution of a large data set. And then Stucnia pectinatus, or sago pondweed, if you prefer, it seems to increase. These are the tolerant plants. And so as you get to higher conductivity, that's where you see it do very well. But it does seem to get to a point, and up here near the top, where it starts to probably level off, or it appears like it may level off. So that's an inflection point as well. So 3 general patterns in these GAM plots. Okay, don't want to get too crazy here, but this is the formula for the cumulative distribution plot method or function. So this analysis was done in R, and there are some R scripts that EPA generated that allowed me to do this work pretty easily. Actually, once it was all set up, it took a little bit of building time to get there. But the important thing with this formula, and I'm not going to pull it apart, the important thing is that having at the numerator the number of samples, the number of the N, is important. The greater the N, the greater the confidence builds. Just like in some other statistical applications, I think you probably all have had some exposure to. But so sample number is very important in applying these methods. Okay, so the second type of plots that we see when we do this analysis are essentially the cumulative distribution plots. These are, again, a probability type plot. It's how the data is distributed. The plant data is distributed across the chemistry data. And we see the curve. It's kind of a normal, parabolic type curve. And this is that inflection point that we saw on the GAM plot. That is actually what's called the XC95, or what they term the XC95. That is the potential extirpation point. So there's a 95% confidence that when you get to a conductivity at this level, the blue joint is starting to hurt. There's a good chance, a 95% chance, based on the probability of distribution across all these different measurements in different locations, that Calamagrostis might even become extirpated under those kinds of conditions. And extirpated, I think you probably know, means that it disappears. So when a species is extirpated, it doesn't necessarily go extinct, because it could be that there's other, in other places, that extirpated means it is no longer locally viable. It's gone from that location. So same thing with the marsh milkweed. We have an XC95 point here. If you compare these red lines to the red lines we saw on the GAM plots, it's actually at the same point. So that's essentially what this CDF and this XC95 analysis really brings us to. Is it's a way to, with large sets of data of biology and chemistry, we can come up with some thresholds. And so I mentioned large sets of data. I had in the models I was running 811 observations for conductivity. That was from 115 different plants that were matched up against those 811 conductivity observations. Chloride, I had somewhat fewer, 380 observations, but we still had 114 plants. And I should probably put this in context. I think many of you are aware that we've got roughly 1,300 aquatic plants in the state. This is, roughly 10% or approaching 10% of that number. But again, most of these observations were occurring in marshes. And I would say generally, we could expect to see maybe 300 or 400 different species in marshes across the state. So my representation is not complete across the entire universe of plants, aquatic plants we have in the state, but it's pretty representative of the marsh communities. Okay. Oh, deep breath. Finally, we get to see some plants. This is just a kind of a smattering, some pretty pictures, if you will, of a few example. I'll show a chart and a couple slides here that will provide more detail. But a few examples of plants from my analysis that were considered to be sensitive to these 3 salinity variables. Carixlasiocarpa, I don't remember the common name. Apologize for that, but wild calla, yellow water lily, marsh cinquefoil, this one, got something on my, wild rice, and we've got boneset here, we've got blue flag Irish and meadowsweet here, Spirea alba. So we've got some grasses, some sedges, some emergents, some shrubs. I don't have any, sorry about that, actively editing as we present. So I don't have any submergents on this slide, but there are submergents that were included. So I kind of just take a little bit of a left field here. I think many of you are familiar with the C values, the coefficients of conservativeness. This is the publication that was done by my colleague and a couple of consultants, expert botanists, Scott Milburn, Mike Butterdash, and Jason Husveth. Produced, I think, in 2007. And it's essentially assigning coefficients of conservativeness for Minnesota's roughly 1,300 some wetland plants, or aquatic plants if you prefer. And so those C values are, they range from 1 to 10 assigned to each specific plant species or subspecies. And at the 10 level, at the upper end, that represents a coefficient of, for that species that is, it shows that that species is, has a high level of fidelity to low disturbance. Many of the species that have C values of 8, 9, even 10, they tend to be maybe a little rarer in the state. They may not necessarily be endangered or threatened. Often they may be. They tend to be a lot more kind of particular about the habitat that they grow in. They're usually pretty sensitive. So that's the upper end of the C value scale. At the lower end, the 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 are the more ruderal K strategy species. If you're familiar with the Grimes plant strategy approach, you know, they're more pioneering. They're more tolerant. They are more adaptive. So each species is assigned a C value, and that's a coefficient that is applied to that C value in all places that it might be found. The non-native, if you prefer exotic plants, are given a 0. They're not really rated. So that's out there to essentially apply the same concept. Gee, we could say, is it a 7, a 10 C value? Those are sensitive plants typically. And so I'm contrasting, that's why I put the C value in there. I'm contrasting in this column the C values to my XC95 values. And these are XC95 at the 10th percentile for each of the 3 salinity variables that I looked at. And here's our list of plants. Again, apologies for the scientific name and not common names, but it includes like acris. I'm trying to remember the common name of acris. Brasinia is water shield. We've got porcupine sedge. We've got the calla is Calla palustris is wild calla. We've got Dolichium rundinaceum. That's a 3-way sedge. Cornus sericea, that's red twig dogwood. Cumarin palustri is used to be Potentilla palustri. I think Marsh cinquefoil is a common name. Salix discolor or pussy willows, blue flag iris, the giant managrass. No, that's Glyceria. Yeah, this is canadensis. So Canada managrass, wild rice, meadowsweet. So hopefully you can read these. Hopefully you can get some. I know this is a lot to put on your screen, and people are just like probably, oh my gosh. But this is what the results look like. Roughly 31 some species met the threshold at the 10th percentile, sorted across all the XC 95 values. And they roughly equate to our C values, which I was pleased to see. There's certainly some exceptions, but they're pretty close. Okay, so let's look at the other end of the spectrum, because we've got tolerant species too. And here's just the kind of quick look at those. Things like Ceratophyllum or coontail. We've got things like purple loosestrife. Sorry, it's not in flower here, but that's Lythrum. Reeknera grass, I think you all know that one, hopefully. We've got stinging nettles. I'm sure you all know that one. Narrow leaf cattail. So I got 2 and 1 in that photo. Duckweed, water plantain. These are species that are at that tolerant end. And again, if we look at the XC95s, they're much higher. And just let me go back to the sensitive. I mistook and I was not able to, with wild rice, I only had enough samples. Here's the 26. And I had not mentioned that, I did mention when we were looking at the formula that the number of observations is important. And I did not use an XC95 for any observation that I had less than 25. I had to have at least 25 plant and chemistry observations in order to consider high enough confidence of the XC95. So I did not have enough for wild rice. It would have been nice to have just kind of compared, what our standards look like. But looking at some of the other ones, so we do have sulfate, they're pretty low and roughly getting just kind of a rough eyeball. It's like 42 gives you a 7. So 10 rather, a value of XC95 for chloride and a 7 in sulfate for this species, grass-leaved pondweed. That's we had a 10 here. It might have been roughly in the 7 range for wild rice. Anyhow, so I digress. Let's just try to wrap this up. So in our biological criteria, biological assessment for wetlands, we use the concept of reference sites. And our reference sites are least disturbed reference sites. And so this is how we develop our criteria for like indices of biological integrity, or the development of, some of you are familiar with my colleague Mike Bordash's work on fluorescent quality, the indicators that Mike developed for those indicator thresholds for FQA, they were based off of reference conditions. And so reference conditions, you collect your data in a set of least disturbed wetlands, and those are our reference standard or reference sites. And so statewide, our reference wetlands, we see for conductivity, 480 is the typical, it's the average. Actually, it's not an average. It's based off the 95th percentile. So 95% of the time, we're going to have a conductivity 480 or less. We're going to have a chloride statewide of 7.5 or less. Sulfate 14 or less. And then we see the numbers as they break out across the 3 ecoregions. So the lower part of this table is what is termed the extirpation-based hazardous concentration. So that's taking all of your XC95 results for all of your plants, and it's lining them up and running a second probability analysis that gives you your hazardous concentration. And that's essentially how to interpret that is what you could expect to be if you were going to derive a state standard. It would be at that level, at an HCO5, hazardous concentration 0.5, we would say for, let's say, chloride, statewide, at 10.8, we would expect that there is a 95% chance that if we go above that concentration, we could expect to see some species start to become stressed. So sulfate, same thing, 22.6. That's not too far off from the 10. I'm not going to delve into the ecoregions per se, but I think the point that 10.8, that's a bit lower than 230. Remember that 230 standard for chloride? It's kind of an older standard. So just wrapping up here, these are some of the kind of conclusions that hopefully you can kind of take away. My rambling and somewhat disjointed that, aquatic plants are sensitive. They're sensitive to salinity. I think we probably already knew that. We see differential responses to different species. Some are much more sensitive than others. Some are actually pretty tolerant as we look at chloride, conductance, chloride, and sulfate as measures of salinity. So I would hope that aquatic plant response would be considered if there is an effort in the future to develop any aquatic life related salinity standards, because plants are pretty good indicators, or so it would seem from these results. The current 230 milligram class 2 standard doesn't appear to be fully protective of aquatic plants in Minnesota, at least not all of them. Collection of additional wetland plant data paired in space and time with salinity variables, the 3 that we looked at. Basically, I'm saying here, if we're going to collect more data, bigger data sets would be better. They'll give us more confidence. So if there's the opportunity, let's collect both plant and chemistry, or chemistry and plant, both of them together, because that will help us get better understanding and develop benchmarks for aquatic plant responses to salinity. Any aquatic life standards looking at salinity are likely going to have to be stratified at least to a level 2 ecoregion. And last, the species extirpation analysis and the hazardous concentration analysis do appear to be appropriate biological response models or approaches to use in developing potential standards. Thank you for your patience. A couple of glitches there with advancing and a couple of stops and starts. Any questions?
Yeah, a couple came through. I'm going to focus on these. There's 2 that are really related. So they were hoping you could go back to the tolerant plant slide again.
Yep.
And just kind of run through some of your recommendations. Some people just want to hear a little bit more about that for like restoration and stuff. So I don't know if you want to add to that or.
Yeah, no, very, very, very key question. Thank you for asking that question. These species, I think many of them, box elder at the top of the list, we probably all know, hey, that's kind of like a C value of a 1 or a 2. It's pretty adaptable, and but if we look at some of these other ones, like some of the mints, like Opus uniflora, I guess the Putsiellos, Sclochoa, white top. This is a way, I guess, to think about restoration at the tolerant end of things. These are species that we typically wouldn't want to see unless the application is we want to vegetate a stormwater pond that likely is going to have a fairly high level of salt influence. These are some of the species that if you're going to plant, these might be good ones to plant. I think many of us see those stormwater ponds. I know I've been in dozens and dozens of them, and I'm not surprised to see cattails. I'm not surprised to see the exotic cattails, non-native maybe. I rarely do see the native cattail in those. So this is an approach to, or it's a set of recommendations of species that may be appropriate in those type settings. And if we looked at the sensitive, those species are, maybe we shouldn't be planting those or managing for those if we know that we're going to be in a situation where there's a higher likelihood of a salinity influence, because they may be more sensitive. I think many of you are probably familiar with the publication that Dan Shaw worked on, Dan Shaw and Rushdie Smith a few years ago, Plants for Stormwater Design. There's not a lot of data, these are largely, some of these kinds of evaluations are based on field observation and anecdotal and professional judgment. And there's a lot of value. I do not mean to discredit professional judgment at all. There's a lot of value in it. But I was a little disappointed when I went to the literature. There are not very many field studies that really use a methodology like this or anywhere near this to try to pull apart and give some real credibility, some statistical rigor to some of those anecdotal type observations that we have. And there are a number of plant lists out there that say, hey, these are the plants that are more tolerant to salt, and they probably are, but it's almost always just based on professional judgment. I'm not discrediting that entirely, but we need more of some of these kinds of analyses. I don't know. I'll step off my bandwagon. Other questions?
Yeah, scrolling up, sorry. Are there plans to update the chloride standard?
Are there plans to update? Short answer, yes. Longer answer. In preparation for the talk today, I work in our surface water monitoring section, which is in the same kind of larger scope division as our standard setting folks, our water quality standard setting folks. And, as I was preparing, I thought, I should check with the standards folks and just make sure they're not going to be too irritated with my putting some of this messaging out there. And so I checked in with them, and they said, no, that they already knew about it. They were the ones that asked me to do it. And they were, sure, go ahead, do it, Mark. And so they did tell me that there are plans to, number one, we removed that specific conductance standard from the class 3 use classes. There is not a state standard currently for specific conductance, with the specific intent that we do need to bring a state standard for conductance back, but likely for aquatic life at a class 2. And for chloride, which the question addressed, are there plans? Yes, there are plans. There's a pretty aggressive docket of issues that the agency is struggling to, not struggling, but is working to address. PFAS, things of that nature, some of the herbicides and pesticides that are kind of slated to be ahead of revising the chloride standard. we're really, what it comes down to is waiting for EPA, who for the last couple of years has been promising release of a new guidance for states and tribes to develop standards for chloride. And I think, you know, the implications of this are, I mean, they're pretty significant. If we were to lower that number of 230, hopefully we wouldn't raise it, but if we were to lower it, that means we have that much more of an issue, of an environmental issue with the salts that are being, you know, loaded into the environment. And, you know, we don't have a way to remove those. They basically are kind of like PFAS, that they're so-called almost, you know, forever. They're there. So if you lower that standard, it's going to give us a lot more impaired waters, and you know that's potentially one side of the problem. But we're not really doing the full service to protecting our aquatic life. So it is a big challenge. It's a major challenge, and it's better to recognize that challenge is before us than to kind of ignore it. So I think we would not want to, is my opinion. So I'm not in the rule writer's chair, but I don't think we would want to work to adopt a new standard until we have some, I use the term cover from EPA, you know, guidance from them. That would be something we could, you know, lean against. Not to say that we can't chart our own course. We've certainly done that on many occasions. But, and yeah, long-winded answer.
Oh, that makes sense. This one actually came from your coworker, Bill, but I think it's a great question. Any ideas on why Salt Lake is brackish versus most of our other lakes being freshwater?
Yeah, geology, Bill. You know, it's just like we've got some pockets of high arsenic across the state, especially western parts of the state. We have high sulfate in many parts of the west, especially western parts of the state, and it all comes back to geology. And you know, it may have some even longer history when there were, you know, seas covering much of the state. But I'll just leave it at that. That that's the nature of the rocks out there. They bear more salts.
Thanks, Mark. That's really good. I was just curious. I was kind of thinking that, but that was helpful. Appreciate it. Good presentation. Thanks a lot.
Bill, you should stay unmuted because I actually have a question for you that came in.
Okay.
Or maybe Jen would like to jump in instead. But this goes back to the original, or the first presentation, excuse me. Can you explain why the PCA requires mitigation for stormwater ponds and constructed ditches when other programs like 404 and WACA do not?
Well,
Hey, this is Jen. Bill, do you want me to handle it?
yeah. Why don't you handle that one, Jen?
We do our best to work with other groups, but our charge, okay, let me back up a moment. So the original intent of the Clean Water Act was that once a project is open for review, the state looks at every single water of the state. And if you look at the definition of water of the state, that's just about every drop of water that's in the state of Minnesota. That is completely overwhelming for us. We do not go to that extent. We work with our partner agencies to make sure that when we are writing any kind of regulation or any kind of permits, that we are complementing them as best as we can. I think I'm getting at your question. It's not very common that we will regulate something that is being used as a form of, I'm not sure how I want to say this. They are all technically waters of the state, and by Minnesota rule, they are all technically something that we need to regulate. But we do our best to make sure that the regulations, the balance of between agencies and programs is reasonable and makes sense.
Okay, great. As of right now, I think that's all the questions that have come in. So in the meantime, I will thank all three of you for joining us today. It was a really interesting presentations. I got a lot out of both of them. So thank you guys so much for joining us.
Yeah, again,
Thank
thanks
you
for
so
the
much for
invitation.
having us.
Yeah, thanks a
Yeah.
lot, you guys. Really
And then
appreciate it.
I'm just gonna give you guys some announcements that I totally forgot to do when we first joined. So anyone who's still listening and doesn't mind listening a little bit longer. But in the meantime, if a question quick came up, type it in and we can still put it at the end here. But so our next forum, we're actually hoping to do some in-person options. So if you happen to be available to join us at REI, kind of pencil that in. We look forward to seeing some of you guys there, but we are hoping to also still host it virtually as well. So hopefully anyone can join either way. The Water Resources Conference is calling for abstracts, so please consider submitting something in the next month. We unfortunately had a lack of wetland presentations last year, and we'd really like to see a lot more wetland stuff at that conference in October. And then finally, the Native Plant Society is meeting tomorrow night. They're going to talk about state seed mixes. If you want to look more info and you are trying to figure out where to find that stuff, we added something to our website, the WPA website, or you could go straight to the Plant Society. So those are the three announcements I totally forgot to mention at the beginning of this presentation. So thanks for letting me do them now. I don't see any other questions. So again, thank you guys for joining us and have a good evening.
Thanks. You as well.
Thanks.
Thanks again.